The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
At that time, Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee and went up on the mountain and sat down there. Great crowds came to him, having with them the lame, the blind, the deformed, the mute, and many others. They placed them at his feet, and he cured them. The crowds were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the deformed made whole, the lame walking, the blind able to see, and they glorified the God of Israel. Jesus summoned his disciples and said, "My heart is moved with pity for the crowd, for they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, for fear they may collapse on the way." The disciples said to him, "Where could we ever get enough bread in this deserted place to satisfy such a crowd?" Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" 7, they replied, "and a few fish." He ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish and gave thanks and broke the loaves, gave them to the disciples, who in turn gave them to the crowds. They all ate and were satisfied. They picked up the fragments left over, 7 baskets full. The Gospel of the Lord.
Thanks to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
For some time I've had a particular fascination with our saint today, St. John of Damascus, who was born just a few years after Muhammad died. And he was thereby caught up in the rapid expansion of the conquests of the Arabs, who had been kind of energized by Islam. Prior to Muhammad, they were warring tribes, warring among one another. And with the unifying monotheism that Muhammad and the Quran brought, they cooperated and they channeled their energy outward and actually had rather fertile conquest of much of the Middle East and North Africa and even into Spain. Why? Because Christians were so divided and fighting among themselves that the fruit seemed to be ripe for them. Now, whether that's a sign of God's favor, I'll leave that up to others to decide. But, of course, at that time, there were very fierce polemics against each other, particularly on the Christian side, against the Muslims, whom they saw, first of all, as kind of heretics, Christian heretics. And, of course, Christians love to fight about heresy and maintain orthodoxy. And so, and rightly so. But the interesting thing about John of Damascus was the Christian communities under Arab Muslim rule were, as long as they behaved, were not particularly persecuted or oppressed. There were some rulers who did that, and they're the ones, of course, that we always, point to as the epitome of cruelty. Sometimes not paying attention to the fact that we Christians could be just as cruel and even more mindlessly cruel. The Muslim Arab conquerors kind of valued anybody who could be productive to their society, anybody who was a good citizen and helpful, shall we say, to the economy. And many Christians at that time were. And Christians were often allowed a fair amount of independence as long as they accepted the conditions of Muslim rule. Okay, so it's within that atmosphere, a relatively new thing, just less than a generation old, that John of Damascus providentially was placed. Because what was racking the Christian civilization at that time, especially of the East, was iconoclasm. A sort of, well, a violent breaking, destruction of all images, because it was felt that they led to idolatry. And so iconoclasm was really a movement to purify the church from this tendency that some felt was idolatry, to be bringing in these images of Jesus and Mary and so on. And within the sphere of power of the Byzantine Empire, at that particular point, if you were fighting against iconoclasm, to maintain the validity of images as part of our religion and devotion, you were liable to have your head cut off. Now, what's interesting is John of Damascus had relative freedom to write in a way that opposed these images and was eventually vindicated in the Second Council of Nicaea. But he had relative freedom because he was living in a Muslim-dominated territory. He was protected by the Muslims, so he was able to do what would not have been safe to do if he had been, let's say, in the centers of power in Constantinople or Antioch or those various places that were under imperial domination. God works in strange ways. God sometimes uses those who are that we would regard as the worst people and our enemies to further the cause of his kingdom. And sometimes God invites us to take a second look at what might be the possibilities of discovering grace where we would least expect it. And that's the takeaway that I have from John of Damascus. You know, he does invite us to rise above the polemics of argumentation, and especially and conflict and polarization, and take another look at maybe God's grace is lurking for us, waiting for us precisely within what we are blind to see because of conflicts and ill will. So, in some ways, embracing that which is difficult and discovering that, could God be working his grace there for me, for us?